While polling here increasingly suggests that the convoy protests are not exactly popular in Canada, they have found some enthusiastic support beyond our borders. It's led to lucrative online fundraising and copycat protests in other countries. With us now to understand the international dimensions of these protests in Washington, D.C., Anya van Wagtendonk, misinformation reporter at the new media company Grid. In our nation's capital, Michael Kempa, associate professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa, and in Ontario's capital city, Brett Carraway, associate professor of internet studies at the University of Toronto, who studies social movements. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's start off with some images from around the world. Citizens have been calling for and planning convoy protests in more than 30 countries, inspired by what we've seen here in Canada. Here's what protests look like in France, where organizers said the Freedom Convoy paved the way. And in this photo, we can see a man holding both the flag of France and also the Canadian flag. In Australia, where protests flooded the capital, blocking roads to the airport and gathering around the parliament. You can see in this photo, obviously a much bigger crowd in this photo with flags and signs that read, "No vaccine mandates." And in Belgium, home to the European Union, just a few days ago, in this photo, we see a woman with her fist in the air screaming in front of a white truck. And finally, even in New Zealand, a country barely touched by COVID, in this photo from protests just a few days ago, we see a man waving a Canadian flag, among others. All right, so now that we've sort of set the scene here, we know that there are some protests being planned in the US, of course, in March. Brett, I want to start with you. This thing seems to have bridged oceans, language barriers, and all sorts of things. Has Canada become sort of the starting pistol for anti-COVID restriction protests across the world?
Well, I don't think that it's necessarily started here in Canada, but there's been a successful occupation here that can be applied in a variety of contexts. And so I think that's sort of the appeal and why you're seeing it pop up in places like Australia, New Zealand. It's an effective means of protest to go occupy some sort of central downtown core. It's not the first time we've seen this. Of course, just as recently as 2011, we saw something similar from the other end of the political spectrum with the Occupy Wall Street protests that started in Zuccotti Park in New York City and then quickly took hold in a variety of different international contexts.
Anya, I want to come to you. In terms of, of all the countries for a protest movement to start like this, why do you think it started here in Canada?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that my team and I have really looked at is the American style of the protest. It really seems to embody a lot of American right-wing rhetoric and symbolism. It's been interesting to see in Ottawa things like the Confederate flag, symbols of American militia movements. So I think one component of this is that here in the States, we're quite used to political polarization, and this seems like a little bit of a newer arrival to the Canadian scene, and therefore perhaps really kind of gives energy to a movement like this. Whereas here in the States, we've had kind of anti-vax and anti-COVID lockdown protests really since April of 2020.
Michael, you're sort of in the thick of it all. I'm sure it's probably been a hard couple of weeks for you. I'm sure you didn't think it was going to be in Ottawa.
Well, Ottawa, of course, being the capital, tends to attract protest. We certainly didn't expect the numbers that arrived here to stay as long as they did, which is incredible because, in fact, as we saw the convoy approaching, they did tell us that they were coming and that they were intending to stay until their political demands were met. So even though they told us, somehow we just either didn't hear them correctly or were not able to compute what it is that they were telling us. We didn't believe it, in other words.
I want to follow up with you, Brett. People copy things that work. Why do you think that this has become a tried and true template for protesting that we're seeing repeated, in France and in Australia?
Well, social movements oftentimes have what we refer to as a repertoire of struggle. And the occupation style struggle, that goes back a long ways. You could go all the way back to 1871 and look at the Paris Commune as an example of this. So occupying a physical space is highly effective in terms of being able to raise awareness about the existence of your grievances, but also to meet other people that you might not be aware of until you actually get together. So in a way, what's happening in Ottawa is kind of like a convention for right-wing populism right now. It's in a way like a meet and greet for people to find each other under this sort of banner of freedom and this right to be left alone and this sort of weariness with pandemic restrictions, et cetera.
Michael, I'm curious, because you're in the thick of it, this is, if you look at the numbers, it's quite a small crowd of people occupying Ottawa right now. Does that play into it as well when we look at the numbers and how easily that could be sort of copied in other countries?
Well, absolutely. It is a Canadian-style protest. We need to own it. Part of the reason we've had this trouble is that we have thought of it as something that could never happen in Canada. It is a divided population on many questions. When people are able to organize under one banner, in this case, COVID-19 restrictions, you bring together all manner of strange bedfellows. They don't need to be well coordinated. They can arrive in small number with heavy machineries and wreak havoc on the city. And then it attracts a life of its own, like a critical mass. On weekends, you have throngs of casual protesters breezing into town in up to 10,000 at any given moment on the weekend. And then it compresses back down to a very small number of hardcore protesters, around 400 during the business hours of the week. This is a very efficient, extremely disruptive strategy that, of course, people with an interest in pushing an agenda around the planet will capitalize on and attempt to replicate.
Michael, the chief of police in your city just resigned over this. Why does it seem police can't get a handle on this situation? You talk about the numbers, you talk about the disruption, and there's plenty of warning.
The police were very much on the back foot, again, in terms of underestimating the threat that was on the way, the disruptive threat. Number two, very much on the back foot because where they have been aggressive in the past, G20 in Toronto about 11 years ago, they reaped all kinds of trouble. They were sued by citizens. They paid out tens of millions of dollars to citizens that had been deemed to be wrongly treated by the courts. They were on the back foot. They thought, okay, everybody's asked us to contain protests, let people have their right to free speech, just mitigate the worst of the damage. Unfortunately, that allowed things to bed in. And once you've got those tons of truck machinery bedded down in the center part of town, very difficult to move if you've got a protest whose objective it is to stay for as long as possible. They weren't here just to make a point and leave town.
Anya, I want to come to you. You've obviously done a lot of research on this group. I'm curious, how would you describe who makes up this movement?
Yeah, there's a real kind of diversity, I think, present. And I think the fact that they are kind of occupying the space for a long period of time allows them to attract a wide variety from people who have legitimate kind of personal and political grievances against lockdown measures or perhaps against COVID itself. Obviously, many people have lost a lot over the course of this pandemic. Those people, I think, come out on weekends, but as my fellow panelists have spoken about, there are also the more kind of entrenched folks who perhaps represent more fringe ideologies, more right-wing ideologies. And so we're really seeing a mix of people who are harnessing this movement for kind of other agendas, and then people who really are just looking to express, some of the pain of the last few years. I also think it's important to note, there's a significant online organizing element to this. And so the relationship between the folks on the ground, the people who are taking time to go protest in Ottawa, along the border and elsewhere, don't necessarily represent the more kind of extreme elements that we are seeing online and some of the perhaps inauthentic activity that we are also seeing online in the organization and kind of stoking of this.
Brett, of the group here, how many of them would you define as sort of radical extremists?
Well, that's hard to say. Certainly there are elements of that. You have sort of the opportunistic political parties that have latched onto it, like the People's Party of Canada, maybe the Maverick Party from the Western provinces. But you have some new actors here, like the Hugs Over Masks, the Vaccine Choice Canada, which is actually an older group, Hold Fast Canada, Unity Canada. So there's all these new social movements or organizations that have developed kind of as a response to COVID lockdowns. You do have the fringe elements there. There is QAnon flags and Confederate flags, which seems very out of place. But I do think it's true, as Anya was saying, there are people in there who are not necessarily neo-Nazis. There are people who are just tired and stressed out. But whenever you have a mobilization, because that's what this is a protest mobilization right now. I wouldn't identify this as a social movement organization or necessarily even a social movement. This is a mobilization to occupy that was organized online. And when you send out an open invitation for anyone to show up at a particular location, you might get some unwanted guests. So going forward, it will be up to this organization to police the boundaries of who belongs to this movement and who is outside of this movement.
So from what it seems, the interests expand beyond COVID mandates and restrictions. It seems to be a combination of COVID fatigue, but is this also bleeding into anti-government, anti-elite, anti-globalization, and such? Brett?
Well, that's been part and parcel of the conservative movement for 20 or 30 years now, which is also why they are there in Ottawa. So yes, that's always part of it. I also think that's why U.S. media figures and some politicians are delighting in this, because anything that will undermine the credibility of public health authorities, democratic governance, sort of works into that frame of liberty, which is always juxtaposed these days against something like governance.
Michael, Brett talked about the Occupy movement. I'm going to bring in another group as well, Yellow Vests. How do these protesters compare to those movements?
Well, the movements that are now attached to certain streams of the organization of the protest, they're all over the place. They're essentially strange bedfellows. They come together, again, under the issue of COVID-19, but within it we see far-right political interests. We also see what we call accelerationists, people who believe that they can bring about civil revolution more quickly by sparking a little bit of civil violence. It brings about the revolution that they require as necessary more quickly. And then there are people that are jockeying for political influence. They see this as an opportunity to build a base of disaffected voters who will get behind them in whatever parties they intend to go back to, whether we're talking Maverick Party or PPC at a later time. So it's very ragtag. And you see it now because cracks in the leadership are showing themselves. We have Tamara Lich, who claims to speak for 75% of the trucker protesters on the ground here in Ottawa. That claim did not go over well with other streams of the organization who feel that they are the dominant leaders behind this process. They're starting to argue amongst themselves as to who is even leading this thing. It goes to show you it's not a cabal, it's fellow travelers who have come together on this issue, each with their own strange objectives.
All right, I want to talk about the money, because there's a whole lot of it. Anya, this is a group that's raised millions in a matter of weeks. You've combed through the donations. You've sort of touched on it. A majority of it seems to be coming from the States, correct?
So a majority of the dollars appear to be coming from Canada, but the majority or the plurality of individual donations are coming from the US. And so there's a kind of interesting, again, fueling coming from smaller scale donations in the US, as well as a couple significant, 4 and 5 figure donations, and then larger donations coming from within Canada. And I just want to note, it seems very unusual to me as an American for Americans to be paying attention to politics in Canada, much less sending money over. And so I think that, again, that really kind of speaks to the ways that there's been this kind of cross-pollination of ideologies and the ways that American figures, media figures, politicians, as well as citizens are kind of expressing their own frustrations or ideologies in a foreign context that, again, I don't think would have been on anybody's radar even 4 weeks ago.
And when you're talking about large payments, we're talking $10,000, $15,000, quite a large chunk. Do we know what it's being spent on?
No, in fact, I don't think that most of the money has been released. There's been freezes placed first on the GoFundMe, the kind of more mainstream crowdfunding platform. And then when that campaign got shut down, it moved to GiveSendGo, which is a Christian, they identify as Christian, and kind of broad-based platform that will not shut down protests. So a number of kind of right-wing January 6th and other type of Proud Boy fundraisers have taken place on this platform. So now the money has sort of been going through there. That has now also been frozen. So it's really unclear where the money is going, who's in charge of it, how it's going to get dispersed, if at all. And I think that's important, to kind of identify how people's donations is one kind of political choice in order to demonstrate support for these folks. But as, again, my fellow panelists have alluded to, there is a real misunderstanding of who is in charge and where the money is going to go and kind of who is benefiting from this. And it seems really easy for folks who are not actually affiliated with the movement in any meaningful way to make a quick buck off of the energy and enthusiasm from certain corners for this movement.
And when we talk about large amounts of money in total, for the GoFundMe account, we're looking at about north of $9 million. And when we talk about the GiveSendGo account, it was about $6 million in just 3 days. Michael, I want to follow up on that. Anya had mentioned, these accounts will essentially be frozen soon to the Emergencies Act. So is all this money rendered useless? Where will it go? Will it be refunded?
In the end, when the government seizes the money under the emergencies legislation, it will essentially go at this point where the government decides. Presumably, there'll be some effort to return some of it. The government will be under no obligation under the emergencies legislation to return it. And in some cases, it will be difficult even to find the original donors if they were given under anonymous donations. But Canadians they're a little bit baffled. Why would so many Americans and American political figures be so concerned to send money to a Canadian protest? It's because they see opportunity. It's the same way that philanthropists invest in causes. They feel that there's likely to be a return on investment in seeing a result, either a socially desirable one from the perspective of philanthropy, or a political one in furthering ideals of destabilizing centralized welfare state governance, authorities, medical authority, to create space generally for far-right ideas. So you would have essentially misanthropes that see an opportunity to send large sums of money to fund destabilization that just generally creates space for these ideas. They're not particularly interested in outcomes in Canada, particularly. It's just more space that normalizes the ideas that they value.
Brett, I want to follow up, on that note that, it has nothing to do with maybe trucker mandates for a lot of these people and the COVID restrictions here in Canada. To what extent are these protests in Canada grassroots versus being influenced from abroad?
I think it's important that we just acknowledge that there are a diversity of stakeholders here, some of whom are everyday Canadians who are just tired. A lot of people who have been unemployed or seen their businesses adversely affected. And then there are more extreme elements here within Canada. There are more extreme elements from outside of Canada, and then there are sort of right-wing political interests in the United States. And all of them are trying to use this, I think, as an opportunity to create a groundswell of support for a larger international movement, maybe the equivalent of something like an Occupy Wall Street for the right.
All right, I want to show a short clip. This is a clip from Fox News. And it sort of gives us a sense of, among other right-wing broadcasters in the U.S., of how they are covering this convoy.
Canada's working class has finally rebelled after years of relentless abuse. Truck drivers are threatening to topple Justin Trudeau's creepy little government with their big rigs. And they may succeed, actually. The protests against Justin Trudeau's vaccine mandates have been far more effective than anyone in charge imagined. For Democrats in the United States, That's a pretty obvious lesson.
Now, Anya and Brett, it's very rare, I think, to see Canada topping the headlines in pretty much every single newscast for the past couple of weeks. Anya, what effect do you think that type of American coverage is having on the movement here?
I spoke with a political scientist who talked about Canada really kind of being a symbol in the minds of Americans. If you are a liberal American, you see it as kind of a socialist paradise where everyone is very kind to each other. And if you are a conservative American, you see it as, evidence of a socialist hellscape where you have no individual freedoms. And I think you're really seeing that in the American media, that this, again, has nothing to do, I think, with a particular perspective on Justin Trudeau and the Trudeau government, or on the Canadian political system, or on the vast and diverse history of Canada as a nation, that it really has to do with being able to cast aspersions on a particular style of governance that right-wing media does not want to see here in the United States, that they perhaps see as a stand-in for Joe Biden. And so I think, again, you're seeing a lot of projection. We have no kind of real indication that this is a working class revolt. It doesn't represent, even close to the majority of truckers. I believe 90% of truckers have already been vaccinated. It doesn't represent anywhere close to the majority of Canadians. You guys enjoy one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. And so really, I think a lot of the right-wing media rhetoric is more about kind of setting the stage for ongoing frustration against these policies and ideas more broadly here in the States and around the world. So really kind of using Canada as a stand-in rather than talking about Canada as a real diverse place.
And I should mention, it's not just the media. Former U.S. President Donald Trump also chimed in, and he said, "We want those great Canadian truckers to know that we are with them all the way." Michael, I'm curious, is American media willing an American copycat convoy movement into existence by talking about it so much? We know that there's going to be sort of a protest being planned in the early days of March. Do you think because we're talking about it, because it's in the headlines, that for their part to blame?
Well, it's certainly promoting the idea, I'm sure in some media outlets in a deliberate type of way. What I will also say, though, I definitely agree with my panelists here that this is not a unified movement. Most of the protesters we see are easygoing people with concerns about vaccine mandates, the friendly face of the protest in the bouncy castles and barbecuing and all of that. These are not the enemies of democracy. And I have found in my opportunities to speak with Americans, through NPR and other forums, they sort of intuitively grasp what's going on in Canada more quickly than Canadians do, because they're used to this. They're used to seeing protests that's fanned up by a small number of non-Democrats to get ordinary people riled up over issues of the day, whether it's COVID-19 or something else that aggravates people, and manipulating those images into suggesting that any state response is a crackdown on ordinary Americans, or in this case, Canadians. Americans get that much more quickly because it's well within their concept of experience. They've seen it many times. We have not.
Brett, I'm hoping you can chime in here in terms of international reputation. I think when when I showed those earlier photos of the Canadian flag, I think 3 weeks ago, the Canadian flag represented something a little bit different. But now when you look at that image, it seems quite interesting. And I'm curious, what does this mean for Canada's international reputation?
Well, I agree completely with both of my panelists here. The portrayal of Canada in U.S. media is a political football. It is a proxy for a longer cultural war that's being waged between the right and left ends of the political spectrum in the United States. I think the potency of this particular protest is that it does undermine the performance of the Canadian economy. What's going on in Ottawa is very interesting to me, but the real sort of pressure point that they've identified are the bridges. So the Ambassador Bridge is worth approximately $300 million a day in trade between Canada and the United States. And the occupation of that bridge, I think, to me, shows a willingness of this particular group of people to inflict widespread harm, indiscriminate harm. Because, of course, shutting down that bridge interrupts patterns of trade, which is particularly important to the automotive industry in the Northeast on both sides of the border. So it's not just that they're interrupting flows of finished goods. These are intermediate goods that are used in the automotive industry. So you're impacting workers on both sides of the border, from Ontario all the way down to the south of the United States. It's also impacting other truckers, right? Because if you're trying to cross at the Ambassador Bridge, now you have to go to a different point and you're piled up in a long queue there. So I think one of the things that this group is going to ultimately have to answer to is how the media portrays them and what public sentiment is towards them, given how willing they are to sort of inflict widespread harm to a number of different people.
Michael, I'm curious to know, did Canadians underestimate how divided we are?
Almost definitely. That was the main reason why we were unable to compute the threat as it literally approached us down the highway. We could see it coming, but we just could not conceive of what it was. We could not imagine that there are a large number of people in our society who simply do not accept the word of the government at face value, that we are divided on our interpretations of science, on our interpretations of collective benefit. We thought we did not have these divisions in our society, that we simply have a kind of consensus around the Canadian model. It is not the case. And it was coming down the highway. We could not conceive of it. We've now taken a close look at it here in Ottawa and at the crossing points, and we'll be better prepared to recognize it next time and set up our institutions to deal with it in a more constructive way.
As we know, we're in week 3 of these protests in Ottawa, and I'm curious, Anya, as COVID dies down, what do you think this group could morph into?
We're looking at the potential arrival of the movement here in the States. And I think an interesting parallel there is that we do not have a unified COVID response here. In many of the places that the proposed convoy would pass through, restrictions have been gone for a while. By the time they reach DC, if they do end up following the timeline they've proposed, the mask mandate here will have been lifted. And so the fact that this can kind of congeal at a time when those restrictions that they are protesting against aren't really present, to me indicates that this can have legs far beyond COVID itself, that COVID gives, again, a real avenue to express legitimate personal experiences and emotions and grievances, but the folks who would kind of harness it for other purposes can latch onto that and really kind of propel it in many different directions. And I just want to note that the planning here in the United States has a particularly kind of fringe element to it. One of the maps that's been released of a potential path has an explicit neo-Nazi meme in the bottom corner, a Pepe the Frog reference. And so watching groups kind of utilize, again, real people, real experiences in order to hopefully move them into a further right, more extremist ideology, I think is something really important to be paying attention to.
Now, in our last few minutes, I wanna kind of get down into that question there, Brett. You know, I'm curious. You know, what is the ultimate victory, or how do we measure the success of this protest from the protesters' point of view? And sort of on that same note, you know, what happens when COVID dies down?
I think that Canadians need to recognize that we're in a sort of political inflection point here. And the question for me is, what happens to this mobilization going forward? One of the measures of success is short term. You can sit around and wait for mask mandates to sort of fall to the wayside, maybe even vaccine mandates to fall away. Maybe the pandemic recedes. That would be nice. And then you can claim that those are as a response to your movement. And I'm not sure how convincing that will be. That some of that may be inevitable. I think the long-term success of this organization will be whether or not there's an organization to it. This is a leaderless movement by and large right now, and it's a messy coalition. It reminds me somewhat of like the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle back in '99. It was the Teamsters and the Turtles, where you saw everybody from progressives to hardcore conservatives like Pat Buchanan, but also somewhat like Occupy Wall Street. At some point, a movement has to adopt some sort of formal organization and has to articulate its vision, its objectives, and coalesce around something. And this organization is so horizontal right now and is playing host to so many disparate groups. Who's going to be part of that and what their objectives are, I think, are really important. The danger here for this organization is that because the rallying cry is freedom and liberty, a lot of that economic anxiety tends to fall around things like immigration, which makes it susceptible to the extremist right-wing groups. And if that's where it goes, I think it'll have difficulty in Canada. Part of the reason the populist movement has taken over the conservative movement in the United States is because of the Senate's outsized emphasis that it gives to rural voters, and the political elections for the president can be won without a majority. It's different in Canada. I think that it is more important for them to galvanize public sentiment and support for their movement.
I got about 30 seconds left, and I want to make sure I get Michael in this because obviously you're in Ottawa. I'm sure you want to see this come to an end some way, but I'm curious, as COVID dies down, what happens here?
Well, once the streets are cleared, ultimately the Canadian state will have to make the most of the inquiry that is mandatory with the Emergencies Act. That inquiry focuses on every reason that the Emergencies Act was necessary at all, which is to say, to identify all the system's failures that were unable to deal with this challenge with police, the different levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, security agencies, intelligence agencies, so that we are ready for next time. Our democratic institutions are fixed, so we do not find ourselves in the similar emergency situation in the future.
Michael, Anya, Brett, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you
My
kindly.
pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.